September 1943 in occupied Haarlem. Afternoon shadows stretch long across the narrow Dutch streets as a young girl pedals her bicycle with a steady, unhurried rhythm. Her dark hair hangs in two neat braids that sway gently against her shoulders, and her worn wicker basket bumps softly with each rotation of the front wheel. She looks small and harmless, the kind of girl you would expect to see running errands for her mother or carrying schoolbooks home, not someone worth even a moment's suspicion. Up ahead, a Nazi checkpoint breaks the flow of daily life. Soldiers stand stiff and bored beside their rifles, scanning civilians with a mechanical vigilance that has become routine after years of occupation. People approach nervously, heads down, papers ready, hoping the soldiers will not suddenly decide to question them further. The girl keeps pedaling forward, steady as a metronome. The soldiers barely register her approach until the last moment. To them, she is just a child on a bicycle, too young to be troubled, too plain to be memorable, too innocent to be dangerous. They do not bother to stop her. They do not ask for her papers. They do not look twice at the basket covered with a folded cloth, assuming it holds vegetables or bread or perhaps nothing at all. Their eyes slide past her the same way they slide past every unthreatening civilian, and in their careless glance lies the fatal mistake. Beneath the cloth in the basket rests a small pistol that she has been trained to use with calm precision. Her hands, soft and young, have practiced the motion again and again in the cramped underground shed where she learned to shoot. As she passes the checkpoint, her grip tightens slightly on the handlebars, not enough to reveal anything, just enough to steady her for what comes next. A few more meters, a slight turn, a moment of isolation between buildings, and the weapon will be in her hand. She knows exactly who her target is and exactly why he cannot be allowed to live another day. The girl who appears so ordinary is already prepared to kill. Her name is Freddie Oversteegen. She is 14 years old, and the question that hangs in the air, heavy as the silence after a shot, is simple. How does a child become someone who rides a bicycle through an occupied city with a gun hidden in her basket, and the calm certainty that she will use it? Freddie Oversteegen's story begins far from the violence of occupied streets. In a world shaped not by war but by hardship, poverty, and a mother's unshakable convictions. She was born on September 6, 1925, in the small village of Schoten, a place that would later become part of Haarlem in North Holland, and her earliest memories were of life aboard a working barge that served as both home and livelihood for the struggling Oversteegen family. The barge was cramped, cold in winter, perpetually damp, and money was always scarce. Freddie's father, Jacob Oversteegen, meant well, but never earned enough to support his family. And her mother, Trijn van der Molen, known simply as Trijn, carried the weight of making a life for her daughters despite constant instability. Freddie and her older sister Truus shared a closeness forged by circumstance, sleeping side by side on straw mattresses and learning early that comfort was a luxury other families enjoyed. The world around them was one where generosity mattered more than possessions, and their mother embodied that belief fiercely. Trijn was a committed communist, not in the abstract ideological sense, but as a woman who believed deeply in justice, equality, and the moral obligation to protect the vulnerable. She was active in international Red Aid and opened her home repeatedly to people fleeing persecution, even when she had almost nothing to offer. Lithuanian refugees hid in the barge's lower hold. Jewish families found temporary safety in the Oversteegen apartment. The girls grew up watching strangers arrive frightened and leave grateful, learning from their mother that helping others was not a choice but a duty. When Trijn eventually divorced Jacob, the separation was not bitter, but it was final. Jacob watched his daughters go, singing them a melancholy French farewell from the bow of the barge, and Freddie would rarely see him again. Life in Haarlem after the divorce was no easier. The apartment was tiny, the winters biting, and Trijn worked tirelessly to keep her family afloat. Yet even in poverty, she continued taking in refugees and teaching her daughters that fascism was a danger not just to distant nations, but to real people standing in their own living room, trembling from the horrors they had escaped. Freddie and Truus absorbed every word, every whispered story from those refugees, every lesson from their mother, and slowly the foundations were laid for what they would one day become. Before Freddie ever picked up a gun, before she ever confronted a Nazi soldier, she was a child shaped by compassion, by fear, by injustice witnessed up close, and by a mother who insisted that when someone needs help, you help them, no matter the cost. In the late 1930s, long before Freddie Oversteegen ever touched a weapon, the quiet apartment in Haarlem had already become a small center of defiance. Refugees fleeing Germany and Lithuania passed through the Oversteegen home seeking temporary shelter, and among them was a Jewish couple who stayed long enough for Freddie and Truus to understand, for the first time, the true nature of what was happening under Nazi rule. The couple spoke softly, but their stories were devastating, describing rights stripped away, homes seized, friends disappearing, and the terror that followed anyone marked as undesirable in the new Germany. Freddie was barely a teenager, yet she listened with a seriousness far beyond her years, absorbing the reality that a powerful and cruel force was spreading across Europe. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and war officially erupted, the Oversteegen household shifted from quiet sympathy to active resistance. Tryon and her daughters began printing illegal anti-Nazi magazines right in their small living room, using a noisy hand press that shook the apartment and forced them to keep watch through the window for anyone approaching. The work was dangerous, but it felt necessary, and the girls quickly proved themselves brave and reliable. At night, Freddie and Truus would slip into the streets with brushes and paste, covering German labor recruitment posters with their own warnings. They painted short, sharp messages on walls, telling Dutch men not to go to Germany, reminding them that workers sent east only strengthened the Nazi war machine. The sisters moved quickly through dark alleys, laughing sometimes at the absurdity of being so young and yet doing something that, if discovered, could cost them their freedom. These missions were their first steps into resistance, fueled by instinct rather than formal training, and every moment carried the thrill of danger and the rising awareness that their country was slipping into something far worse than ordinary political conflict. They were not soldiers, not yet, but they were beginning to understand the stakes of defiance. The printing press, the secret slogans, the quiet acts of sabotage were the early threads of a path that would soon lead them far deeper into resistance than they ever imagined possible. When the German invasion began on May 10, 1940, everything the Oversteegen family feared became reality almost overnight. Dutch neutrality meant nothing to the advancing German forces as planes roared overhead and Rotterdam was bombed into a smoldering ruin. A deliberate act of terror that shattered the nation's resolve and forced surrender within 5 days. Haarlem fell under occupation, and the quiet acts of resistance Freddie and Truus had performed suddenly became far more dangerous. The family burned their radical literature to avoid immediate execution, and the refugees staying with them had to be moved to new hiding places, a heartbreaking task made worse by the painful truth that many of them would later be discovered, deported, and murdered. Freddie would recall decades later that they never heard from those people again, and that this loss remained a wound she carried throughout her life. Amid the tightening grip of German control, the girls continued their underground activity, unaware that their efforts had drawn the eye of someone far more deeply embedded in the resistance. In 1941, a man named Frans van der Wiel, commander of the Haarlem Council of Resistance, arrived at their modest apartment. He greeted Truus and Freddie with formal politeness, taking off his hat and choosing the least comfortable chair out of courtesy. But the purpose of his visit was grave. He had heard of 2 young girls who distributed illegal pamphlets with unusual fearlessness, and he was assembling a group capable of far more dangerous operations than propaganda. He explained that the resistance needed people who could carry weapons, plant explosives, and eliminate specific targets who were actively hunting Jews and resistance members. Truus asked the question that hung unspoken in the air. Would they have to kill? Frans answered honestly, yes, but only those directly responsible for atrocities. He then asked for their mother's permission, and Tryon surprised no one by granting it. But she left her daughters with a single instruction that would echo through their lives. Always stay human. Do what must be done, but never lose compassion, never become what you are fighting against. Freddie was 14 years old when she accepted this responsibility, stepping across a threshold where childhood ended and resistance began. Once Freddie and Truus formally joined the resistance, their lives shifted from nighttime graffiti and illegal pamphlets to the kind of missions that demanded absolute precision and the willingness to face death without hesitation. Their training took place inside an underground potato shed on a remote farm, an unlikely setting for lessons in killing. Yet it became the place where Freddie learned to handle pistols, rifles, and even grenades with methodical discipline. She practiced loading, aiming and firing over and over until the motions felt like extensions of her own hands, because in the resistance there was no room for mistakes. Their first major operation was not an assassination, but an act of sabotage designed to destroy 2 Nazi-occupied warehouses. Freddie and Truus, dressed as if headed to a social outing, hair neat and makeup carefully applied, and approached the guards with shy smiles that disarmed suspicion instantly. While the soldiers flirted clumsily with the seemingly harmless girls, resistance fighters slipped into position and set the buildings ablaze. The success of the mission taught Freddie a deeply unsettling truth: that her youth and femininity were weapons the Nazis never thought to fear. And every time she used them, she felt both empowered and hollow, as if a piece of herself was being reshaped into something she did not fully recognize. Her first kill came not long after. The details remain murky, even in historical accounts. But what is certain is that Freddie rode her bicycle with a weapon hidden in her basket, approached a Nazi soldier as part of a planned operation, and pulled the trigger with steady hands. In that instant, she crossed a line from which there was no return, and though she did not hesitate, the moment the man fell, she felt the instinctive urge to run toward him and help him stand. A flicker of humanity that she carried in secret for the rest of her life. After that, the missions intensified. Freddie took part in honey trap operations, entering taverns where German officers drank, catching their attention with a smile and leading them on nighttime walks that ended in secluded woods where either she or a waiting resistance fighter would end their lives before disappearing into the trees. Between these lethal operations, she helped smuggle Jewish children to safety by simply holding their hands and pretending to be an older sister on an afternoon walk. The contrast was staggering. The same girl who planted explosives and shot armed men was gently guiding frightened children through occupied streets. And this duality became the defining weight of her wartime existence. The arrival of Hannie Schaft in 1943 transformed the resistance cell into something far more focused and formidable, introducing a third young woman whose intellect, resolve, and unmistakable appearance would turn her into one of the most iconic figures of the Dutch resistance. Hannie was a law student from Amsterdam, deeply principled, fluent in German and unwilling to submit to Nazi authority, a refusal she proved when she declined to sign the mandatory loyalty oath imposed on all university students, effectively giving up her education rather than compromise her conscience. She had grown up with Jewish friends and understood quickly and personally what the occupation meant for them, which fueled her determination to resist not as a distant political gesture but as a direct moral obligation. With her bright red hair, which would later force her to dye it black, she became both a symbol and a target, known to Nazi intelligence simply as the girl with the red hair, a name whispered with both frustration and fear as reports of her involvement in operations spread. When Hannie joined Freddie and Truus, the trio fit together with an almost uncanny natural alignment, each bringing strengths that filled the other's weaknesses. Hannie was the strategic thinker, calm, analytical, and fluent in the enemy's language. Truus was the decisive leader, grounded, fearless, and brutally pragmatic when circumstances demanded it. Freddie was the planner, the tactician with the youthful face that disarmed suspicion and allowed her to execute honey trap missions with chilling effectiveness. Together they carried out sabotage operations that damaged German supply routes and disrupted troop movements, including demolishing sections of rail track between IJmuiden and Haarlem and planting explosives on bridges that cut off vital military access. Yet the war around them grew increasingly brutal, and what they witnessed only hardened their resolve. They saw families lined against walls and executed without cause. They saw Dutch civilians dragged into the streets to be shot as punishment for imagined resistance. One day, Truus watched a Dutch SS soldier snatch a baby from its father's arms and kill it by slamming it against a wall. An act of barbarity so shocking that Truus reacted without hesitation, raising her weapon and killing the soldier on the spot. Not as part of an operation, but as a human response to inhuman cruelty. The psychological toll of these experiences mounted with each passing month. Freddie and Truus screamed in their sleep, woke in terror, fought invisible enemies in the dark, and pushed the trauma aside each morning because survival left no room for collapse. Then tragedy struck on March 21, 1945, when Hannie was stopped at a checkpoint in Haarlem with illegal communist newspapers and a concealed pistol. She was arrested, interrogated, tortured, and eventually identified by the red roots of her growing out hair. A daring rescue attempt by Truus failed when Hannie was already gone. On April 17, 1945, just weeks before liberation, Hannie was executed in the dunes near WWII, offering one final act of defiance when the first bullet grazed her and she told her executioners that she could shoot better than them. Her body was buried in a mass grave among hundreds of resistance fighters, the only woman among 422 men. And her death carved a wound in Freddie and Truus that would never fully heal. Liberation arrived on May 5, 1945. But for Freddie Oversteegen and her sister Truus, it marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One where the danger had passed, but the weight of what they had seen and done settled over them with a heaviness they could not shake. They were 19 and 21 years old, ages when most young people are only beginning to imagine their futures. Yet they had already lived through years of killing, sabotage, and terror. And the sudden silence after the fighting ended felt unnatural, as if the world had shifted into a state they no longer knew how to inhabit. Freddie spent several months recovering at Paleis Hentloo, the royal palace that Queen Wilhelmina had opened to resistance fighters as a place of rest. But the elegant surroundings could not soften the memories that clung to her thoughts with relentless persistence. When she returned to civilian life, she joined the Political Investigation Service, helping track down and arrest Nazi collaborators. A role that seemed like a natural extension of her wartime work until she realized that justice was not being applied equally. The wealthiest and most influential collaborators were shielded, protected by networks of power, while only the poor and politically insignificant were punished. The hypocrisy sickened her, and she resigned rather than continue participating in a system that contradicted the values she had risked her life defending. Freddie eventually married an engineer named Jan Dekker and had 3 children, attempting to build a peaceful life defined not by violence but by creation and care. Yet the war lived inside her, resurfacing every year on May 4th, during the national remembrance ceremonies, when she would wake with dread and feel the past press against her with unbearable clarity. Insomnia plagued her, depression came in long waves, and she often retreated into herself, unable to escape the echoes of the trauma she had absorbed as a teenager. Meanwhile, the world around her began honoring others. Hannie Schaft became a national icon with books, memorials, and films celebrating her bravery. And Truus, who became an artist and public speaker, received recognition, awards, and the title Righteous Among the Nations. Freddie supported her sister, served on the Hannie Schaft Foundation, and never sought attention. But the imbalance became a quiet ache within her, a sense that her own sacrifices had faded into the background of history. She had fought as fiercely as anyone, yet she lived in the long shadow cast by others, her courage known only to those who had been there. In the decades after the war, Freddie Oversteegen carried the invisible weight of a nation that preferred simpler stories. Stories where heroes were easy to celebrate and politics were uncomplicated. Stories where women who had killed for the resistance were quietly set aside, because their existence challenged the narratives the country wanted to build. The Cold War cast a long shadow over recognition for left-leaning resistance members, and Freddie and Truus, raised by a communist mother and long associated with communist youth organizations, found themselves pushed to the margins of official memory. While other resistance fighters were granted pensions soon after the war, the sisters were denied these benefits for more than 20 years. And when they were finally awarded them in the 1960s, there was no back pay, no apology, and no acknowledgement of the reason for the delay. Freddie spoke of her frustration gently but with unmistakable pain, admitting that she sometimes felt jealous of Truus, who became a public figure and received honors that Freddie believed were deserved but still difficult to watch when she herself remained largely unknown. She would remind people quietly that she had been in the resistance as well, and those few words carried a lifetime of unspoken emotion. Yet even when overlooked, Freddie never stopped supporting the causes connected to her past. She served on the board of the Hannie Schaft Foundation, helping preserve the memory of the friend whose death had scarred her so deeply. Her loyalty to Hannie and to the truth of their shared experiences endured even as historical recognition lagged behind. It was not until 2014, when Freddie was 88 years old, that the Dutch government finally extended to her the honor she had earned 7 decades earlier. Prime Minister Mark Rutte personally presented Freddie and Truus with the Mobilization War Cross, a rare gesture by a sitting head of government and a moment that Freddie's son Remy described as one of the proudest days of her life. Streets in Haarlem were named after both sisters, ensuring their names would become part of the landscape they had once risked everything to protect. And a 2016 documentary titled Two Sisters in the Resistance introduced their story to a new generation, allowing Freddie, in her old age, to speak with clarity and vulnerability about the years she had kept locked inside herself. But time was catching up with the family that war had once bound together. Truus passed away in 2016 at the age of 92, and with her death, a bond that had survived sabotage missions, executions, fear, and trauma finally came undone. Freddie's health declined in the years that followed, and she spent her final days in a nursing home in Driehuis, not far from Haarlem. On September 5, 2018, one day before what would have been her 93rd birthday, Freddie Oversteegen died, the last surviving member of the legendary trio. Obituaries spread across the world, telling the story of the girl with braids who rode her bicycle past Nazi checkpoints with a gun hidden under a folded cloth. The young woman who shot soldiers, smuggled Jewish children, planted explosives, and helped shape the resistance in ways long overlooked. They repeated a sentence she had spoken late in life, a sentence that captured the truth of her struggle. Women do not count. They still do not. Yet in telling her story, in refusing to let her actions fade into the background, the world finally took a step toward proving her wrong. Freddie Oversteegen counted, and she always had.